Zahra. I am Afika Safa Zahari, as I introduced before. I'm from International Islamic University, Malaysia, and it is very nice to have you today. Thank you so much for joining in. So this is like interview for my research project because currently I'm doing master in literary studies, and one part of my class is I have to read your books and analyze it from a feminist approach. So
Of course.
yes, so um, before I start my interview today, I would love to give a short introduction about you, so that like people
Sure.
who view this video will know who you are. So, Miss Zahra is the editor of Women on the Ground. So, Miss Zahra is also a Lebanese British journalist who write about politics, culture, and society in Middle East. She's also a best-selling and award-winning editor, and her writings and journalism has appeared in BBC News, Bloomberg's News, Vice, and Al Jazeera English, and in Roots and Kingdom, and also literary hubs. Um, Ms. Zahra was born in United Kingdom in 1984, and she completed her education in University of Manchester and Columbia Journalism School. So when Arab Spring erupted in 2011, Ms. Zahra reported the uprising for Bloomsburg, and from there she was inspired to produce this book, Our Woman on the Ground, because she wanted to give the women reporters from the Arab world a platform to share her stories. Can you introduce to us about Our Woman on the Ground, and how do you make the selections? And in your opinion, what are the some highlights of the book?
Sure. Firstly, thank you, Afika, for having me. Really appreciate the efforts that you're putting into learning the book. Um, yeah, so, the book was a project that really, the goal of it was really to amplify the voices of women across the Arab world, women who live in the Arab world, women who are from the Arab world, women who are in the Arab world, and have kind of an inherent emotional attachment to the region for those reasons. And in terms of the selection of the various essays, I wanted to capture the diversity of the region, and also the diversity of women across the region. So that really it encapsulates how layered it is, because oftentimes I think, at least in the West, the portrayal of the region tends to be slightly one-dimensional. So I wanted to kind of celebrate the women, but also to present a new way of looking at the region through their own experiences. So to do that, obviously, given that the region is quite vast, you have so many
Mm.
countries and you have different, nationalities and ethnic and religious identities. I wanted to ensure a range of countries. So I made sure that the women are from countries all over. We have representation from Palestine, from Syria and Lebanon, from Egypt, Libya, Sudan, Iraq. Unfortunately, we weren't able to have representation from every single country for several reasons. In hindsight, I wish we could have done that, and perhaps there could be a second volume for that. But really, country important to me, religious representation. So we have, Muslims, both religious and non-religious. We have Christians. We have, people who identify otherwise. So that was important to me. Also, generationally, I wanted there to be a range of ages. So we had women in their 60s and we had women in their 20s, right? So that's kind of showing that wide range of experiences and different approaches to journalism. And then also wanted people to be different types of journalists. So you had people who are more like citizen journalists, people who are photographers, people who work for blogs and websites, people who work for mainstream media in the West, really a wide range. I do want to I do want to note on the subject of nationality and belonging that it was important for me also to represent women who live in the diaspora, because there's such a large number of Arabs or people of Middle East and North African ancestry who have been forced to leave their home countries. Oftentimes that has to do with war and displacement. For example, in the case of Palestine, we had a Palestinian who is currently living in France. We have Syrians who are no longer living in Syria because it's not safe to live there. I'm a dual national because my parents left Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. So that's an experience I wanted also to capture in the book. So there's a section called Crossfire, which is kind
Yes.
of a double entendre. It means like living in between two identities and also being between the bombs, so to speak. So I hope that kind of captures your first question. For your second question on the main themes, I mean, the book is divided into different themes that mostly stood out to me and the editor of the book at the publishing house, Penguin. We decided on those themes after all the essays were completed, and we felt certainly the first section on remembrances was about, you know, women who are kind of looking back at their experiences and how they impacted them on a personal level. I mentioned the Crossfire one. We have one on transition, you know, which could be about societies in transition, such as Saudi Arabia, or the journalism industry in transition. That essay was by Rula Khalaf. We have a section on resilience, which I think is kind of universal. It's across all of the essays. All of the women are resilient, but in these particular essays, there's very much this sense of, you know, women who had encountered these really intense obstacles and challenges, and their focus in the essay was how did they then overcome those challenges. I'm actually just going to get the book because I've forgotten there's definitely another section. Oh, and exile. Exile is really important, of course, because so many of the women, as I said, you know, they have dual identities or dual national experiences and are going through some form of exile because of conflict in their homelands. I think the most acute ones there are those who have left Syria because it is still so fresh for them. You know, this exile is still very new to them.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers your questions.
Yes. Thank you so much, Miss Zahra. So, what did impress you the most personally when you're hearing these women's stories?
This is a great question. I would say commitment to the craft of journalism, despite all of the obstacles that they faced. You know, in some cases, these women had to risk their own lives and the lives of their families as well. And you can imagine particularly for the women who were mothers, you know, who were struggling also with motherhood and reporting on of children, for example, and the emotional toll that that takes on these women in a very personal sense, that you can't really have a barrier between you and your job because it is so very personal for them. And there's an essay by Zainab Hayim in which she says at one point that, you know, these numbers that you see on your screens of death tolls, these are my friends, my lovers, my teachers, my family. You know, this is a deeply personal story. And despite all of those risks, you know, she continued to put her life on the line to deliver the story. I opened my essay with my introduction with the story of Ruqayya Hassan, who was a citizen journalist in Syria, bravely had online profiles, even though she used the pseudonym. She paid for her work with her life. I mean, ISIS ended up killing her. So it's that sense of, you know, to journalism, commitment to getting the story out there, despite all of those risks. And one of my favorite essays, and I don't think it's been talked about enough actually, is Shamail al-Noor's essay. She's a Sudanese journalist, and her essay is titled Words Not Weapons. It was translated from Arabic into English. And I'm going to read just the last paragraph of that essay because to me, it gave me goosebumps. You know, it shows how she was. So she says, "Today I continue along my journalistic path in Sudan, and my beliefs and commitments remain unshaken. I didn't fully understand the value of my choices until after I faced all of this danger and harassment from the states, from tribesmen, and from Islamists. I have been a journalist for a decade now, and let me tell you what I have learned. This is what journalism should be, or else it shouldn't be at all. Though these experiences have had high prices, they haven't weakened or deterred me. I have no other option but to move forward, like the many brave journalists who face persecution. This is our destiny, and we remain ever devoted to it." I love that last line, you know,
Yes.
the way she approaches it, like this is her destiny to be a journalist and she's going to remain committed and devoted to it. So
Yes.
I think that to me is really the most powerful message in the book. And then subsequently, after the book was published, many young women from all over the Arab and the Muslim world would message me saying that they're aspiring young journalists and that they are actually motivated by these women to embark on careers in journalism. So that strength, it kind of comes through the pages, and then other young women are inspired by that, which was also very fulfilling for me.
Yes. Yes, that is true. So, in your experience, is it more challenging to be woman journalist in the Middle East than elsewhere?
You know, this is a very good question, and I've been asked it before. And I think the best way to answer it is that we have to consider several factors here. So there's going to be overlap, I think, between, let's say, more conservative countries across the globe, and also overlap in countries where there may be poor records of women's rights or human rights. So in some ways, you know, it's not extremely unique to the Middle East. At the same time, I think there's a confluence of these two factors that does make it unique.
Yeah.
So the Middle East ranks poorly for women's rights, and it also ranks poorly for protections for journalists. So when you put these two things together, you find that then it becomes even more of a challenge to be a woman journalist. Of course, you might find those two factors elsewhere, but I'm just highlighting that the Middle East and North Africa has consistently been the worst in those two areas at the same time. So that creates a unique situation. You know, there are many challenges for women journalists in the Middle East. Oftentimes they start at home where their families won't want them to be journalists because they know that there are risks to journalism. Let's say if you, even if you are still living with your parents, for example, your parents want to protect you from that kind of risky career. And also they might not want you to be out in the public space, this public sphere in a way that might elevate your profile. And put your life at risk. And then if you're, for example, married and you have children, there's a similar worry or concern there. There are also difficulties on the, you know, just on the ground when a woman's, you know, out in the public space. In some countries, it's more difficult than others, such as Egypt or countries where there is warfare. People might be facing sexual harassment or threats on their lives, or it's just an unsafe environment for women to be in. Also, in some countries, you need a male companion, a mahram, to take you from one place to another or to accompany you. So that difficulties, such as in Yemen. And then you face more difficulties in the workplace. So let's assume that some of these women have a job. They may face some form of discrimination in the workplace because they're a woman, or again, sexual harassment has been common, or a lack of trust, you know, a lack of faith in this person to go out and do an assignment because they think it'll be easier for a man, so the man will take an assignment. Again, this varies from country to country, but there's some overlap in some of the countries. And then at the highest level, you know, these women can face threats from the governments that they report on, and from non-state actors, terrorist groups, and so on. So the risks are many. And while I do think, yes, there is some overlap with other countries, I just think because that sense of risk is heightened, specifically in the Middle East and North Africa, in such an extreme way, then it makes the experience even more difficult.
That is true. Personally, when I first read this book, and I also and I also compare with the feminist approach, the first thing that came out to my mind is definitely how this women struggle against a male-dominated working space, and I can actually see how it's a struggle for them to actually show themselves out and prove that they can be as equal as men. Okay.
Absolutely agree.
What are the effects that you have been able to observe in the women who have lived through war, protests, and riots? Do you think that they tend to be impacted by this experience more than men?
This is a really interesting question. It's difficult for me to respond in in a way that I'm not assuming some sort of
Mm,
psychoanalytic knowledge,
yeah.
or mental health knowledge
Mm,
that I don't necessarily have
mm-hmm.
in a research-oriented sense. But I can tell you anecdotally that I think some of the things that I've observed from the book, from the women in the book, is that there's a lot of guilt that the women carry in embarking on this career, specifically for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, that their families can be put at risk, especially if they're mothers. There's a lot of guilt. How can they be doing this work when they're putting their lives at risk and their children are at home? And a couple of the women in the book, I think Asma al-Ghul, the Palestinian journalist, captures this really powerfully. I think guilt and a little bit of shame as well were very strong themes. And anecdotally, I don't see that amongst male reporters.
Mm,
I've not seen that amongst male reporters. Now, that's one element of it. I think the trauma that conflict journalists experience can be universal, irrespective of gender,
yeah.
because you are witnessing atrocity upon
Yes.
atrocity.
Yeah.
You are witnessing death. You are experiencing the risk of losing your own life. I think that, in a sense, again, and I'm not, a licensed therapist
Mm,
or a
mm,
psychiatrist or a psychiatrist,
mm,
but I think that we often see that trauma irrespective of gender. I think where I would make a distinction would be the guilt. It's just that the guilt
the-
for the women seems to be particularly heavy.
mm,
Um, and I found that to be interesting because I wasn't necessarily expecting that much guilt.
yeah.
But if there was to be another theme in the book that didn't have a section, I
Yeah.
would I would actually label it guilt. But
Mm,
all of the women experience, most of them, some form of PTSD from the work that they did,
mm,
and their approach to this book was actually in a way cathartic for them
mm,
because they were almost for the first time acknowledging that they had been impacted in this way.
yeah.
So while I do acknowledge that there is trauma for them, I think that they were strong enough to write these chapters, and that is such a sign of courage and
Yes.
bravery to me.
Yes. Yes. Even when my lecturer actually commented about your work, she said that this sahafiyat is really brave, very courage, and we should like at least like take that as a as a um, like as an example, so that we can
Yeah.
actually learn something from them when we are reading their stories. And she was actually somehow affected while she's reading the book. She said that she can feel the trauma, and she can also feel the struggles of the Sahafiyat. And that's why she really recommend this book to all her friends, including me, for
Oh,
my
really?
study. Yes. What kind of reaction has your book received from people living in both like Muslim and non-Muslim countries? Have any of the writers have been singled out for criticism by anyone?
Yeah, this is a great question. The only person who's been really outspoken about this to me is Zainab Hayim, who
Mm,
currently lives in exile in London,
mm,
and she did face um, some trolling or online harassment for her chapter, in which I would say she's actually very critical of the regime,
mm,
uh, with anyone who caused her harm when she lived in Syria. Um, I think other than that, I'm sure that some of the women have had personal struggles,
mm,
but um, I would say that I have, I'm often asked how people have responded to the book, but I do want to say that the authors themselves, the contributors themselves, despite any fallout that might have been caused by their words, actually feel very proud of the work. And
mm,
if anything, they're constantly messaging me to tell me thank you for giving them the space to tell
mm,
their story. And they're saying what I said before, which is that the experience was very cathartic for them. So I'm very proud of that aspect of, their work. In terms of elsewhere, I mean, the Western world or the Muslim world, as I said, there have been many young women that reach
mm.
out to me
Yes,
um, to to say they would like to embark on careers
yes,
in journalism,
yes,
and that's I would say mostly women who live within the, Muslim world or Arab world or Middle East, however we want to refer to these different regions. Um, and then some women who live in the diaspora who are, second or third generation. They want to embark on careers themselves. So they've reached out to me, sometimes asking for advice, sometimes just to say thank you for editing the book.
Mm,
And that to me means that I succeeded really at what we put together here, because that means that the women's work has been amplified and shows the value of journalism from the Arab world and journalists by Arab women, journalism by Arab women. I think in the West, it's also been really, really received well, because I think many people who have read the book for the first time feel that they're getting the modern history of the region
mm,
through the words of women from
mm,
the region, when often they may have been reading accounts of, let's say, foreign male journalists or foreign female journalists, and not really relying on the locals to learn about the region.
mm,
And I think it's also a very unique way to learn about the region, because it's not your average nonfiction book about, let's say, the Arab-Israel conflict or Syria or Lebanon. It's a memoir, essentially. It's a series of mini memoirs that are telling the story of, the history of the region through this personal lens. So I think in that sense, it's been really interesting to Western readers who are not familiar with the region,
mm,
or who are familiar with it, but they don't really hear from the women
mm,
themselves.
mhm,
So in all respects, it's been really positively received. I can think of very few times that I've read any form of criticism, and I'm very, very grateful for that. Although I do welcome criticism as well.
mm. In the future, are you planning to publish part two of Our Woman on the Ground that covers the voices of women reporters from different religion? Not
Yeah,
just
this is
religion, region. Yes, sorry.
sure,
Yes.
no problem. This is something I've certainly thought about, and I would
Mm,
be open to it. For now, I'm focusing on another book project that I'm
mhm,
working on now.
mhm,
But I think with the success of the first book, it showed that there's an appetite for these voices.
mhm,
And as I said, while I did strive to represent different nationalities and countries in the book,
mhm,
I do feel that there were nationalities and countries that were not represented that could be in a second volume. So
mhm,
places like Tunisia, Algeria, Bahrain, the UAE, different
mhm,
countries. And I would probably rely more on solely local voices who,
mm,
for example, don't know English or don't have exposure to the West,
mm.
because really this book is not for the West. This
Yes,
book is for a global book. And
yes,
I want people to feel that there's no one audience in
yes,
mind, so certainly I would consider this at a later stage, although now I'm focused on other things.
yes. Okay. So, last but not least, um, do you have any message for women out there, especially Muslim women?
Yes. This is such a good question. I come from a very conservative Muslim family,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm very grateful for my upbringing. And I was very lucky because my parents really supported my career choices. I think there was a bit of struggle in the beginning because, I had suitors coming to the house when I was 19. They wanted to marry me off quite early. And yes, but then they realized, after I really pushed for it, that my career was something that was important to me, and that they were going to support me educationally and also in any way they could, morally, moral support. But that doesn't come easily to everyone. There are more families that might be, for example, hesitant. There's two stories in the book that actually people should read, by Amir al-Sharif and Iman Hilal, who came from more conservative family backgrounds, in which they really had to fight to show that this is the career that they wanted to do. And what I want to emphasize is that it's possible to do that. And also, there are different ways to do it. You could embark on a professional career in journalism. You could also become an online presence, through social media or blogging. If you need to use a pseudonym, you can use a pseudonym and still have impact. And then also, I want to say, the real importance of our story and telling our story and being present in the discourse, because I feel that Muslim women in particular are written about so much by other people.
Yes,
We
that is
need
true.
more and more to take our own stories into our own
Mm,
hands and to tell those stories, and also to show that, this is not a homogeneous world. The Muslim
mm,
world is so incredibly diverse,
mm,
and there are so many different experiences of Muslim women,
mm,
and we should be more present, not just in journalism, but also in nonfiction,
mm,
in fiction, in publishing, to have more voices online and in social media. And I would advocate for any a Muslim woman who is ambitious and who wants to tell her story
mm,
to use the tools that she has, to tell that story and to commit to becoming a storyteller. And I will say that whoever wants to do that is needed. We
mm,
need you. We
mm,
need these women, and you can find support also in other women.
mm,
I'm a big supporter of supporting other women,
mm.
almost like you form a sisterhood of
Yes.
women across the world from different countries.
Mm,
I'm always open to giving any of my readers advice if they would like advice, or
mm,
helping them in any way. And I think that's important to realize, is that we're connected. We're
mm,
connected. We can help each other.
mm,
um, so that's really not one thing, it's several things, but just
mm.
to share that, these voices are needed. And I hope that the book inspires people in
Yes.
that way.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ms. Zahra, for the interview today. Honestly speaking, you are such a wonderful person.
You're so kind. You're so
I,
kind.
I love reading your books. I love listening to you and talking
So
now.
you're
um,
so sweet.
I, I,
Honestly.
I really hope that I'm able to meet you in real life in future soon.
Please stay in touch. My second book is a little bit different. It's about the
Mm,
history of eyeliner, which I'm
mm,
wearing, as you can
mm,
see. But it focuses actually very much on telling stories of non-white communities all around
mm,
the world, and
mm,
how non-white communities perceive of beauty. And in a way, it's also amplifying the voices of sort of marginalized communities as
mm,
well,
mm,
which is what I'm really committed to in my work. So
mm,
even though it's about something very different, it's about eyeliner, I'm
mm,
traveling the world to tell these stories.
mm.
So it might be different to what you're used to, but I hope you like that too, because I'm very proud of that work, and I'll be finishing the book hopefully later on this year.
Yes, I will look forward to buy it.
Thank
I
you.
love your writing, so
You're so kind.
yes, I will look forward for your future work, and I will continue to support you. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Anika. I will stay in touch with you too, and I really appreciate the time. Thank you
Yes,
so much.
thank you so much, Miss Sarah. Have a
You're
nice
awesome.
day.